Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in rural Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1943 in Rappahannock County, Virginia, carried with it an unusual chill that seemed to settle not just in the mountain hollows, but in the hearts of those who lived along the winding dirt roads that connected the scattered farmsteads. It was here, in a weathered clapboard house overlooking the Shenandoah Valley, that neighbors first began to whisper about Cordelia Ravenscraft and the peculiar circumstances surrounding the men who had shared her name. The house itself stood like a weathered sentinel among the oak and maple trees, its white paint peeling in long strips that fluttered in the mountain wind like the pages of an old book. Built in 1887 by Cordelia's grandfather, Ezekiel Thorne, it commanded a view of the valley below that was both breathtaking and isolating. The nearest neighbor lived more than 2 miles away, connected only by a rutted path that became impassable during the heavy rains that frequently swept through the Blue Ridge Mountains. According to county records maintained at the Rappahannock County Courthouse, Cordelia Thorne was born in that same house on December 13, 1898, the only offspring of Ezekiel and Martha Thorne. The birth certificate, signed by Dr. Cornelius Whitman, notes that the delivery was complicated and that Martha Thorne died 3 days later from what the doctor described as postnatal complications and excessive bleeding. Ezekiel raised his daughter alone until his death in 1919, when Cordelia was 21 years old. Those who knew Cordelia in her youth described her as an unusually intelligent woman with striking pale blue eyes and prematurely silver hair that she wore in a severe bun at the base of her neck. Margaret Hensley, who taught at the one-room schoolhouse in nearby Flint Hill, recalled in a 1962 interview that Cordelia was her most gifted student, but also the most unsettling. "She had a way of looking at you," Hensley said, "as if she could see right through to your bones. Smart as a whip, that girl, but there was something cold about her, even as a young person. She never played with others her age, never laughed at our little jokes, always watching, always listening." The isolation of the mountain house seemed to suit Cordelia perfectly. After her father's death, she lived alone for 3 years, managing the small farm and maintaining the property with an efficiency that impressed the few neighbors who occasionally encountered her. During this period, she developed what locals would later describe as an almost supernatural ability to remember details about people's lives and relationships. She seemed to possess an encyclopedic knowledge of family histories throughout the valley, despite her relative isolation from the community. Dr. Whitman, who had attended the Thorne family since Cordelia's birth, noted in his private medical journal that she possessed an unusual memory for personal details. In an entry dated July 15, 1920, he wrote, "Called to the Thorne place today to treat Miss Cordelia for a minor injury sustained while repairing the barn roof. During our conversation, she demonstrated a remarkable recall of medical information I had shared with her father years ago, including details about other families' health issues that I was certain I had never discussed with her." When I asked how she had come by such knowledge, she merely smiled and said that people often revealed more than they realized when they thought no one was listening. The first man to enter Cordelia's life as more than a casual acquaintance was Jeremiah Blackthorne, a traveling merchant who dealt in farm equipment and household goods throughout the Shenandoah Valley. According to the marriage certificate on file at the courthouse, they wed on October 15, 1922, when Cordelia was 23 and Jeremiah was 36. Local records indicate that Jeremiah had been married previously to a woman named Sarah, who had died in a house fire in Page County in 1920. No family members survived that tragedy. Jeremiah was described by those who knew him as a gregarious man who enjoyed talking and had a particular fondness for sharing stories about the people he met on his routes. He was known to frequent Murphy's General Store in Washington, Virginia, where he would hold court among the local farmers, regaling them with tales of the strange and wonderful things he encountered in his travels. His wagon was a familiar sight throughout the valley, and his arrival in any community was usually greeted with enthusiasm by those eager to hear news from other parts of the region. Samuel Murphy, the store's owner, later told investigators that Jeremiah seemed to undergo a dramatic change in personality after marrying Cordelia. In a sworn affidavit dated March 12, 1925, Murphy stated, "Before he married that woman, Jeremiah was one of the most talkative fellows you'd ever meet. Always had a story to tell, always eager to share what he'd seen or heard on the road. He knew something interesting about every family in 3 counties, and he wasn't shy about sharing it. But after the wedding, he became quiet, almost sullen. When I'd ask him about his travels, he'd just shake his head and say he'd learned it was better to keep some things to himself." Murphy's testimony continued with even more troubling observations. "The last time I saw him alive, Jeremiah looked like a man who was carrying a terrible burden. His eyes were bloodshot, like he hadn't been sleeping, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be following him. When I asked him what was wrong, he said he'd been learning things about people that he wished he'd never found out. He said his wife had a gift for getting people to tell her their secrets, and that she'd convinced him to share stories about his customers that he should have kept to himself." The transformation in Jeremiah's behavior was corroborated by several other witnesses who had known him before his marriage. Thomas Whitlock, a farmer who had regularly purchased supplies from Jeremiah, testified that the merchant had become increasingly paranoid and secretive. "He used to tell me all about the other farms he visited and what crops folks were planting," Whitlock stated. "But in his last few months, he wouldn't talk about anyone else. Said it wasn't safe to share such information. When I pressed him about it, he said there were people who would use innocent gossip for harmful purposes." Perhaps the most revealing testimony about Jeremiah's state of mind came from Father Michael O'Brien, the priest at St. Catherine's Church in nearby Sperryville. In a confidential statement given to diocesan authorities in 1925, Father O'Brien described a disturbing conversation he had with Jeremiah just weeks before the merchant's death. "He came to me in a state of extreme agitation," the priest wrote. "He said he had committed a grave sin by revealing confidential information about his customers to his wife. He was particularly concerned about having shared details about families' financial difficulties and personal problems. He begged me to help him find a way to warn the people he had betrayed, but he was afraid that doing so would put him in even greater danger." The circumstances of Jeremiah's death on February 8, 1925, were officially recorded as accidental, but the details of the incident raised immediate suspicions among those familiar with the case. According to the report filed by Sheriff Daniel Cromwell, Jeremiah had been working on the roof of the house, attempting to repair damage caused by a severe winter storm. The official account states that he apparently slipped on the ice-covered shingles and fell approximately 20 feet to the frozen ground below, striking his head on a large stone that protruded from the foundation. However, several aspects of the scene troubled investigators from the beginning. Dr. Whitman, who was called to examine the body, noted in his private journal that the injury pattern was inconsistent with a simple fall. "The skull fracture," he wrote, "appeared to have been caused by multiple impacts rather than a single blow. Additionally, the deceased's hands showed no signs of the cuts or scrapes that would be expected if he had attempted to break his fall. Most puzzling of all, his body was found lying perfectly straight, arms crossed over his chest, a position that seemed highly unlikely for someone who had just fallen from a roof." The investigation took an unusual turn when Sheriff Cromwell discovered that Jeremiah had been carrying a leather satchel containing what appeared to be personal correspondence from various families throughout the valley. The letters, which were found scattered around the body, contained intimate details about financial troubles, family disputes, and other sensitive matters. When Cromwell questioned Cordelia about the correspondence, she claimed that her husband had been collecting testimonials from satisfied customers, though she could not explain why such letters would contain such personal information. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Kellerman, who assisted with the investigation, noted in his report that the positioning of the correspondence around the body seemed deliberate rather than random. The letters appeared to have been arranged in a specific pattern, he wrote, almost as if someone had placed them there intentionally. When I suggested this possibility to Sheriff Cromwell, he dismissed it as coincidence, but I remained convinced that the scene had been staged. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of Cordelia herself regarding her husband's final days. In her statement to Sheriff Cromwell, she described Jeremiah as increasingly agitated and fearful. He kept saying he should have minded his own business, she told investigators. He said there were secrets that weren't meant to be shared, and that he was afraid someone would come looking for him because of what he knew. He mentioned having learned things about certain families that could be used against them if they fell into the wrong hands. When pressed for details about what Jeremiah might have discovered, Cordelia claimed ignorance. He wouldn't tell me specifics, she insisted, said it was better if I didn't know, but I could tell he was tormented by guilt over something he had done or said. He talked about people who might want to hurt him because of information he possessed, though he never named anyone in particular. The investigation into Jeremiah's death was complicated by the disappearance of several potential witnesses. Two men who had been seen talking with Jeremiah in the days before his death suddenly left the area without explanation. Samuel Murphy reported that strangers had been asking questions about Jeremiah and his roots, but these individuals were never identified or located. The sense of fear and paranoia that seemed to surround the case made it difficult for investigators to gather reliable testimony. Sheriff Cromwell, despite these troubling circumstances, seemed eager to close the case quickly. In his final report, dated March 1, 1925, he concluded that Jeremiah Blackthorn's death was a tragic accident resulting from hazardous working conditions and inclement weather. The case was officially closed without any criminal charges being filed, though many in the community remained convinced that the truth had not been revealed. Following Jeremiah's death, Cordelia inherited his merchant business along with his detailed knowledge of families throughout the Shenandoah Valley. However, she chose not to continue his trading routes, instead selling his wagon and inventory to another merchant from Culpeper County. She returned to her isolated existence in the mountain house, though neighbors noted that she now received far more visitors than she had before her marriage. Margaret Hensley, who encountered Cordelia several times during this period, observed a significant change in the widow's behavior and appearance. She seemed to have aged considerably in the months following Jeremiah's death, Hensley recalled, but there was also something different about her demeanor. She had always been reserved, but now she seemed almost predatory. When she looked at you, it felt like she was cataloging every detail of your appearance and behavior for some future purpose. During the 2 years following Jeremiah's death, Cordelia began what local residents would later describe as her collecting period. According to testimony from various sources, she started acquiring books, newspapers, and documents from throughout the region, often paying surprisingly high prices for items that seemed to have little obvious value. She showed particular interest in personal correspondence, family records, and private diaries, often approaching recently widowed individuals or families dealing with estate matters. Martha Hendricks, who ran the local lending library, recalled that Cordelia became one of her most frequent visitors during this time. She would come in maybe once a week, Hendricks said in a 1959 interview, and she always had the same request. She wanted to see any personal papers that families had donated, especially letters and diaries from people who had passed away. She said she was working on a genealogy project, tracing family histories in the valley for posterity. Hendricks continued with more disturbing observations, but there was something about the way she studied those documents that made me uncomfortable. She would take extensive notes in a small black leather book that she always carried with her, and sometimes I would see her lips moving as she read, as if she were memorizing particularly important passages. She seemed less interested in genealogical information than in personal details about family relationships, financial matters, and private conflicts. The librarian also reported that Cordelia had an uncanny ability to remember details from documents she had read months earlier. She could quote specific passages from letters or diary entries with perfect accuracy, even weeks after she had seen them. It was almost as if she had a photographic memory for other people's secrets and personal information. The second significant man to enter Cordelia's life was Thaddeus Nightingale, a widowed attorney from Culpeper who had been handling some legal matters related to her late husband's estate. Court records show that Nightingale first met Cordelia in April 1927, when she came to his office to discuss the transfer of property that had belonged to Jeremiah. According to his law clerk, Morton Hayes, Nightingale was immediately impressed by Cordelia's intelligence and her detailed knowledge of legal procedures. Nightingale was 52 years old when he married Cordelia on September 14, 1927, in a small ceremony at the Culpeper County Courthouse. His first wife, Catherine, had died of influenza in 1924, leaving him without family members. Those who knew Nightingale described him as a meticulous man who prided himself on his ability to keep confidences and maintain the absolute trust of his clients. His legal practice specialized in handling sensitive family matters, estate disputes, and other cases that required complete discretion. The law firm of Nightingale and Associates had been established in 1898 and had built its reputation on representing some of the most prominent families in central Virginia. The firm's client list included wealthy landowners, successful merchants, and even some government officials who required legal services that would remain completely confidential. Nightingale's reputation for discretion was so well established that people would travel considerable distances to seek his counsel. Morton Hayes, who had worked as Nightingale's clerk for over a decade, later provided detailed testimony about the changes that occurred in his employer after the marriage to Cordelia. In a deposition taken in 1952, Hayes described how Nightingale's work habits and professional demeanor underwent a gradual but dramatic transformation. Mr. Nightingale had always been extraordinarily careful about maintaining client confidentiality, Hayes testified. He never discussed cases outside of the office, and he kept all sensitive documents locked in a vault that only he could access. But after his marriage to Mrs. Nightingale, he began taking files home with him, claiming that he needed to work on them in the evenings. This was completely unlike his previous behavior. Hayes continued with even more troubling observations. Mrs. Nightingale would occasionally visit the office, and during these visits she would engage in lengthy conversations with clients while they waited to see her husband. She had a remarkable ability to put people at ease and encourage them to share personal information about their situations. Mr. Nightingale seemed pleased by his wife's interest in his work, and he began including her in discussions about various cases, something he had never done with his first wife. The transformation in Nightingale's approach to client confidentiality became more pronounced as his marriage progressed. Samuel Greenberg, a fellow attorney who shared office space with Nightingale, later recalled that his colleague seemed energized by his discussions with Cordelia about the legal matters he was handling. Thaddeus would tell me about the long conversations he and Cordelia would have in the evenings. Greenberg stated in a 1952 deposition. He said she had a remarkable ability to understand complex family relationships and legal issues, even though she had no formal training in the law. He found her insights valuable, and he often mentioned how she could remember details about cases and clients that he himself had forgotten. However, Greenberg also noted that Nightingale began expressing concerns about his wife's intense interest in his professional work. He mentioned that she would sometimes stay up late into the night reading through his case files, claiming that she was helping him organize his work. While he appreciated her assistance, he seemed troubled by the depth of her knowledge about his client's private affairs. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, Nightingale's personal physician, documented the attorney's declining health during the final months of his life. In medical records that were later subpoenaed by investigators, Dr. Blackwood described his patient as suffering from severe insomnia, anxiety attacks, and what appeared to be symptoms of chronic stress. In a detailed entry dated May 15, 1929, Dr. Blackwood wrote, "Patient reports that he has been experiencing severe difficulty sleeping, often lying awake for hours, worrying about his professional responsibilities. He admits to having shared confidential client information with his wife on numerous occasions, initially believing that such communication was normal between spouses. However, he has begun to suspect that she may be using this information for purposes he does not understand or approve of." The physician's notes continued with increasingly alarming observations. Patient describes finding his wife reading through his case files late at night, claiming she was simply helping him organize his work. When he questioned her about specific cases, she demonstrated an intimate knowledge of client details that went far beyond what he had shared with her. He has become convinced that she may be accessing his files without his knowledge and possibly communicating with his clients outside of his presence. Dr. Blackwood's final entry regarding Nightingale's mental state is dated June 23, 1929. Patient is in a state of extreme distress and has requested medication to help him sleep. He believes his wife may be involved in some form of information scheme, using confidential details obtained from his law practice to manipulate or coerce his clients. He has discovered evidence that she has been corresponding with several of his clients, though he has not been able to determine the content of these communications. The physician's notes also revealed that Nightingale had begun taking extraordinary precautions to protect his client files. Patient reports that he has started keeping the most sensitive documents in a locked cabinet at the office rather than bringing them home, as had become his habit. He has also instructed his clerk to monitor who has access to the office and to report any unusual visitors or activities. The circumstances surrounding Thaddeus Nightingale's death on July 4, 1929, were even more suspicious than those that had surrounded Jeremiah's demise 2 years earlier. According to the official report filed by Sheriff Cromwell's successor, Deputy Sheriff Robert Fairfax, Nightingale was found in his study at approximately 6:30 a.m. by his wife. The body was seated at his desk, apparently having died during the night while working on legal documents. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though no autopsy was performed at Cordelia's request. She claimed that her husband had been suffering from chest pains for several weeks, but had refused to seek medical attention due to his heavy workload. Dr. Blackwood, who was called to examine the body, found this claim inconsistent with his recent treatment of the deceased. "I had examined Mr. Nightingale just 2 weeks prior to his death," Dr. Blackwood noted in his private records, "and while he was certainly under considerable stress, he showed no signs of heart disease or any other condition that would lead to sudden cardiac failure. His blood pressure was elevated, but not to a dangerous level, and his overall physical health was good for a man of his age." More troubling details emerged during the investigation. The study where Nightingale's body was found had been meticulously organized, with all of his case files sorted and arranged in a way that was inconsistent with his normal working habits. Morton Hayes testified that his employer was generally disorganized in his personal workspace, preferring to spread documents across his desk while working on multiple cases simultaneously. The scene in the study looked like someone had spent considerable time going through Mr. Nightingale's papers and organizing them according to a specific system, Hayes stated. This was completely unlike his normal working style. Additionally, I noticed that several important case files were missing entirely, including documents related to some of our most sensitive clients. Deputy Sheriff Fairfax noted the discovery of a half-empty bottle of laudanum on Nightingale's desk, despite the fact that the attorney had never been prescribed the medication and had no known medical conditions that would require its use. When questioned about the laudanum, Cordelia claimed that her husband had been using it to help with his chronic insomnia, though she could not explain where he had obtained the substance. The investigation revealed that Nightingale had been seen in Washington, Virginia, on the afternoon of July 3rd, apparently conducting business at the local bank and post office. Several witnesses reported that he seemed agitated and kept looking over his shoulder, as if concerned about being followed. Thomas Whitlock, who encountered the attorney outside the post office, later testified that Nightingale appeared to be mailing a large envelope to an unknown recipient. He was acting very strange, Whitlock stated, kept glancing around nervously, like he was afraid someone might be watching him. When I tried to make conversation, he just nodded politely and hurried away. I'd never seen him behave like that before. He was usually very friendly and talkative. The envelope that Nightingale had been seen mailing was never located, despite efforts by investigators to trace it through postal records. This mystery deepened when Morton Hayes revealed that his employer had mentioned preparing a detailed report about some of his cases, apparently documenting information that he felt should be preserved in case something happened to him. Mr. Nightingale told me that he was compiling a comprehensive record of certain client matters, Hayes testified. He said it was an insurance policy in case he was unable to continue practicing law. He seemed to think that someone might try to prevent him from fulfilling his professional obligations to his clients. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation was the discovery that several of Nightingale's clients had been contacted by unknown individuals in the days following his death. These mysterious visitors claimed to have information about the client's legal matters and offered to provide assistance with ongoing cases. However, when the clients attempted to verify these individuals' credentials through the law office, they discovered that no such contacts had been authorized. Margaret Townsend, who had been a client of Nightingale's in a complicated estate matter, reported receiving a visit from a woman who claimed to be associated with a law firm. She knew details about my family situation that I had only shared with Mr. Nightingale, Townsend stated. She said she was there to help resolve some issues with my case, but when I asked to see some identification or credentials, she became evasive and eventually left without explanation. Similar reports came from at least 6 other clients, all describing visits from individuals who possessed intimate knowledge of their legal situations but could not provide valid credentials or authorization. Deputy Sheriff Fairfax concluded that someone had gained access to Nightingale's confidential files and was using that information to approach his clients, though the purpose of these contacts remained unclear. Despite the suspicious circumstances surrounding Nightingale's death and the subsequent mysterious contacts with his clients, no criminal charges were filed. Cordelia inherited her husband's estate, including his law practice, which she promptly sold to Samuel Greenberg for a price that many considered far below its actual value. She also disposed of most of Nightingale's personal effects, claiming that she found them too painful to keep. Following the sale of the law practice, Cordelia returned once again to her mountain retreat, but this time her isolation was less complete. Neighbors reported seeing various visitors arriving at the house at all hours of the day and night, many of whom appeared to be strangers to the area. These visitors often carried packages or documents, leading to speculation about the nature of their business with the widow. Dr. Whitman, who had known the Thorne family for decades, noted a significant change in Cordelia's appearance and behavior during this period. In his personal journal, he wrote, "Encountered Mrs. Nightingale at the post office today and was struck by her transformed appearance. She has lost considerable weight since her husband's death, and her naturally pale coloring has become almost ghostly. More concerning is a quality in her eyes that I can only describe as predatory. When she looks at you, it feels as though she is cataloging your weaknesses and vulnerabilities." Censor. The period between Nightingale's death in 1929 and Cordelia's third marriage in 1935 was marked by a significant expansion of her document collection activities. Using the inheritance from her second husband, she began placing advertisements in newspapers throughout Virginia and neighboring states, offering substantial payments for family papers, old letters, and personal diaries. These advertisements always used the same language. Serious collector seeks family correspondence and personal documents for historical preservation. Generous compensation offered for materials of genealogical or historical significance. The response to these advertisements was substantial, with families throughout the region sending Cordelia boxes of personal documents that had been stored in attics and basements for generations. Many of the families who responded were dealing with financial difficulties and welcomed the opportunity to receive payment for items they considered worthless. Others were motivated by Cordelia's claim that she was preserving important historical materials that might otherwise be lost. However, some of those who sold documents to Cordelia later reported disturbing consequences. Several families found themselves being contacted by strangers who possessed detailed knowledge of their personal affairs and family histories. In some cases, these contacts led to blackmail attempts or other forms of coercion. When the affected families tried to trace the source of these security breaches, the trail inevitably led back to the documents they had sold to Cordelia. Harold Pemberton, a farmer from Fauquier County who had sold his grandfather's correspondence to Cordelia in 1931, later testified about the consequences of that transaction. "About 6 months after I sold those letters to Mrs. Nightingale, I started getting visits from people who knew things about my family that should have been private," Pemberton stated. "They knew about debts my grandfather had incurred, about disputes he'd had with neighbors, even about personal relationships that had been secret. These people used that information to pressure me into selling them land at below-market prices." Similar stories emerged from other families who had sold documents to Cordelia. The pattern was always the same. Several months after the sale, family members would be approached by individuals who possessed intimate knowledge of their personal affairs and used that information to manipulate or coerce them. The affected families began to suspect that Cordelia was not simply collecting documents for historical preservation, but was actively using the information contained in them for malicious purposes. Margaret Hensley, who had maintained periodic contact with Cordelia since their school days, visited the Mountain House in 1932 and was shocked by what she discovered. The house had been transformed into something resembling an archive or library, Hensley recalled. Every room was filled with filing cabinets and document boxes, all meticulously organized according to some system that only Cordelia understood. She had correspondence from hundreds of families throughout the region, all carefully cataloged and cross-referenced. Hensley's account continued with increasingly disturbing details. When I asked her about her collection, she said she was preserving the true histories of Valley families, making sure that important information wouldn't be lost or forgotten. But the way she talked about these documents was unsettling. She referred to them as her inventory and spoke about the families as if they were subjects to be studied rather than real people with lives and feelings. The librarian also reported that Cordelia had developed an elaborate filing system that cross-referenced individuals by their vulnerabilities and potential usefulness. She had separate categories for people with financial problems, family secrets, legal troubles, or other issues that might make them susceptible to pressure or manipulation. It was like she was building a database of human weakness and vulnerability. During this period, Cordelia also began establishing contact with certain criminal elements in the region. Federal investigators would later discover that she had developed relationships with confidence men, blackmailers, and other individuals who specialized in exploiting human weaknesses for profit. These associations would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of her activities and the ultimate fate of her victims. The third and final man to marry Cordelia was Bartholomew Ashworth, a federal investigator who had been assigned to examine a series of mail fraud cases in the Shenandoah Valley region. The investigation had led him to examine various business dealings and financial transactions, some of which involved families that had previously sold documents to Cordelia. Ashworth was a career law enforcement officer with over 20 years of experience in federal investigations, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to identify patterns that others missed. According to federal personnel records, Ashworth first encountered Cordelia in November 1934 when he arrived at her home to ask questions about documents she had purchased from a family that was under investigation for fraudulent land sales. The meeting was recorded in his official report as brief and unproductive, with Cordelia claiming to have no knowledge of any illegal activities and expressing surprise that the documents in question might have been connected to fraud. However, Ashworth's personal notebook, which was discovered among his effects after his death, reveals a very different picture of that initial encounter. His private notes describe Cordelia as remarkably knowledgeable about regional family relationships and business dealings, and suggest that he immediately recognized her potential value as a source of information for his investigation. Subject demonstrates encyclopedic knowledge of local families and their affairs, Ashworth wrote in his notebook. Claims to be an amateur genealogist, but her information goes far beyond typical family history. She knows details about financial transactions, property transfers, and business relationships that suggest access to private correspondence and confidential documents. Could be valuable asset if properly cultivated. The professional relationship between Ashworth and Cordelia gradually evolved into something more personal over the following months. Federal records show that Ashworth made multiple visits to her home, ostensibly to gather background information about various families and their business practices. His official reports during this period became increasingly detailed and comprehensive, filled with information about complex family relationships and financial dealings that could only have come from someone with access to extensive private documentation. Agent Marcus Kellerman, who worked closely with Ashworth during this period, later testified that his colleague's investigative success rate improved dramatically after he began consulting with Cordelia. Bartholomew started solving cases that had been stalled for months, Kellerman stated. He would come into the office with detailed information about suspects and their associates, backgrounds on their families and business dealings, even knowledge of their personal vulnerabilities and financial pressures. When I asked him about his sources, he said he had developed a relationship with someone who had access to historical documents and family records. Kellerman's testimony revealed that Ashworth had become increasingly secretive about his information sources and investigative methods. He stopped sharing details about how he was gathering intelligence, claiming that he needed to protect the identity of his sources. This was unusual for Bartholomew, who had always been very collaborative and transparent about his work. He seemed to be operating according to different rules, and some of us began to worry about the ethics of his methods. The marriage between Cordelia and Bartholomew took place on August 19, 1935, at the courthouse in Washington, Virginia. Ashworth was 41 years old at the time, a lifelong bachelor who had dedicated his career to federal law enforcement. His colleagues described him as a methodical investigator with an exceptional memory for details and an unwavering commitment to following proper procedures and protocols. The federal investigation files show that Ashworth's work performance initially benefited from his marriage to Cordelia. His case closure rate improved significantly, and his superiors began to view him as one of their most effective investigators. The intelligence he provided about regional criminal activities was so detailed and accurate that other agents began requesting his assistance with their own cases. However, this period of professional success was accompanied by growing signs of personal stress and ethical conflict. Agent Kellerman documented several conversations in which Ashworth expressed concerns about the methods he was using to gather information and the potential consequences of his actions. Bartholomew started asking strange questions about federal regulations and the penalties for sharing classified information with unauthorized persons, Kellerman testified. He wanted to know about the procedures for reporting security breaches and what would happen to an agent who accidentally revealed confidential details to someone outside the agency. When I asked him why he was concerned about these issues, he said he was worried about inadvertently violating protocols. Dr. Patricia Whitestone, a federal medical officer who provided psychological evaluations for agents experiencing work-related stress, examined Ashworth in early 1937 at the request of his supervisors. Her confidential report, which was declassified in 1965, described an agent who was struggling with severe anxiety and guilt over his professional conduct. Agent Ashworth presents as an individual experiencing significant psychological distress related to perceived violations of his professional ethics, Dr. Whitestone wrote. He admits to having shared confidential case information with his spouse, initially believing that such communication was normal between married partners. However, he has become convinced that his wife may be using this information for purposes that conflict with federal law enforcement objectives. Dr. Whitestone's evaluation continued with more troubling observations. The agent describes his wife as having an unusual interest in his work and a remarkable ability to remember details from his case files. He reports that she often knows more about his investigations than he has consciously shared with her, leading him to suspect that she may be accessing his files without his knowledge. He expresses fear about confronting her directly, as he believes she may have information that could compromise his career or personal safety. The psychological evaluation also revealed that Ashworth had begun taking extraordinary precautions to protect sensitive information. Agent reports that he has started keeping classified documents at the office rather than bringing them home, and that he has requested a secure filing cabinet for his most sensitive materials. He has also begun varying his routes to and from work, and has asked to be assigned to different types of cases, apparently in an effort to limit his wife's access to certain categories of information. The federal investigation into Ashworth's activities began in earnest when other agents noticed irregularities in his case files and reporting procedures. Agent Harrison Caldwell, who was assigned to conduct an internal security review, discovered evidence that classified information had been systematically removed from federal files, and that some documents showed signs of having been copied or photographed. Agent Ashworth's case files showed a pattern of missing documents and incomplete records, Caldwell reported. When questioned about these gaps, he claimed that he was reorganizing his filing system and that the missing materials had been temporarily removed for review. However, our investigation revealed that many of the missing documents contained sensitive information about ongoing investigations and the identities of confidential informants. The security review also uncovered evidence that Ashworth had been removing classified materials from federal offices and bringing them to his home, apparently to share with his wife. Agents who searched his residence found photocopies of federal documents hidden throughout the house, along with detailed notes and summaries that appeared to have been prepared by someone other than Ashworth himself. The scope of the security breach became clear when investigators discovered that Cordelia had been systematically cataloging and organizing the federal information provided by her husband. Her document collection had expanded to include detailed files on federal investigations, criminal organizations, and law enforcement methods and procedures. This information had been integrated with her existing collection of personal and family documents, creating a comprehensive intelligence database that covered both official and private affairs throughout the region. Federal investigators also discovered evidence that Cordelia had been using the classified information provided by her husband to manipulate ongoing investigations and protect certain criminal enterprises from federal scrutiny. She had apparently identified cases where her existing contacts could be compromised by federal action and had taken steps to warn them or help them avoid detection. The investigation revealed that Cordelia's network of information and influence had grown to include corrupt officials, criminal organizations, and legitimate businesses throughout Virginia and neighboring states. She had been trading federal intelligence for money, favors, and access to even more sensitive information, creating a web of corruption that extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Agent Caldwell's classified report on the scope of Cordelia's operations was filed in December 1937 and remained secret for nearly 30 years. According to this document, which was finally declassified in 1965, Cordelia had developed connections with criminal networks throughout the Mid-Atlantic region and had been functioning as a sort of information broker for various illegal enterprises. The subject appears to have been operating as the central node in a sophisticated intelligence network that connected federal law enforcement, local government, criminal organizations, and legitimate businesses, Caldwell wrote. She systematically identified individuals with access to valuable information, then used a combination of manipulation, seduction, and ultimately coercion to gain control over them. Her 3 marriages appear to have been carefully calculated moves designed to give her access to different categories of sensitive information. The federal investigation also revealed the likely circumstances surrounding the deaths of Cordelia's previous husbands. Evidence found in her personal file suggested that both Jeremiah and Thaddeus had eventually discovered the extent to which they were being manipulated and had threatened to expose her activities to authorities. In each case, their deaths had occurred shortly after they had taken concrete steps to limit her access to sensitive information or to warn others about her activities. Pattern analysis suggests that the subject eliminated her husbands when they became liabilities rather than assets, Caldwell's report concluded. Each death occurred at a point when the victim had begun to understand the true nature of his wife's activities and had started taking measures to protect himself or others from her influence. The timing and circumstances of these deaths appear to have been carefully orchestrated to look like accidents, while ensuring that the subject retained control over the information and resources she had acquired through each marriage. However, by the time federal agents arrived to arrest Cordelia in early 1938, she had vanished completely. A thorough search of her mountain house revealed that she had apparently left in great haste, taking with her only the most sensitive and valuable documents from her extensive collection. Her current whereabouts were unknown, and despite an extensive nationwide manhunt involving multiple federal agencies, she was never apprehended. The investigation into Cordelia's network continued for several years after her disappearance, with federal agents working to identify and prosecute all the individuals who had been compromised by her intelligence operations. The scope of corruption that was uncovered led to the indictment of dozens of public officials and the exposure of criminal organizations throughout the region. However, the full extent of the damage caused by her activities was never completely determined, as many of her victims chose to remain silent rather than face public exposure of their involvement. Agent Bartholomew Ashworth's body was discovered on October 12, 1937, in the basement of the mountain house where he had lived with Cordelia. The official report stated that he had apparently fallen down the wooden basement stairs while carrying federal case files, striking his head on the concrete floor below. However, the circumstances of his death immediately aroused suspicion among federal investigators, who recognized the similarities to the deaths of Cordelia's previous husbands. The basement where Ashworth's body was found had been converted into a sophisticated filing and document storage area, complete with fireproof cabinets and a comprehensive cataloging system. Federal agents discovered that this basement archive contained copies of hundreds of classified documents, personal correspondence from families throughout the region, and detailed intelligence files on criminal organizations and corrupt officials. Agent Kellerman, who was among the first federal officers to arrive at the scene, noted several disturbing aspects of Ashworth's death in his official report. The body was positioned at the bottom of the stairs in a way that seemed inconsistent with an accidental fall, he wrote. The head injury appeared to have been caused by a blunt instrument rather than by striking the concrete floor, and there were no defensive wounds or other injuries that would be expected if the victim had attempted to break his fall. Perhaps most significantly, the federal case files that were supposedly being carried by Ashworth at the time of his death were found neatly arranged around his body with no signs of having been scattered by a fall. These files contained some of the most sensitive information in the federal investigation, including the identities of confidential informants and details about ongoing operations against major criminal organizations. The federal investigation into Ashworth's death was led by Agent Harrison Caldwell, who had previously been investigating security breaches in the agent's case files. Caldwell's team discovered evidence that Ashworth had been planning to resign from federal service and had apparently been preparing to provide testimony about his wife's activities to federal prosecutors. Agent Ashworth had contacted our Internal Affairs Division just days before his death, Caldwell reported. He had requested a meeting to discuss potential security violations and had indicated his willingness to provide full cooperation with any investigation into his conduct. He seemed to understand that his career was over, but he wanted to minimize the damage to ongoing cases and protect the safety of confidential informants who might be compromised by the information he had shared. The investigation also revealed that Ashworth had been taking extraordinary precautions in his final weeks, apparently because he feared for his safety. He had varied his daily routines, had begun carrying a personal weapon, and had left sealed envelopes with trusted colleagues containing information about his wife's activities. These precautions suggested that he was aware of the danger he faced, but had underestimated the immediacy of the threat. Federal agents discovered that Cordelia had been monitoring her husband's communications and activities, apparently through a network of contacts she had developed within federal law enforcement and local government. She had advance warning of his plans to cooperate with investigators and had taken steps to prevent him from providing testimony that could expose the full scope of her operations. The basement archive where Ashworth died contained evidence of Cordelia's most sophisticated intelligence operations. Federal investigators found detailed profiles of hundreds of individuals, including federal agents, local officials, business leaders, and criminal figures. These profiles contained personal information, psychological assessments, and strategic recommendations for how each individual could be manipulated or controlled. The subject had essentially created a comprehensive intelligence database that rivaled anything possessed by federal law enforcement agencies, Agent Caldwell wrote in his final report. She had detailed information about the personal and professional vulnerabilities of individuals throughout the region, along with specific plans for exploiting these weaknesses to achieve her objectives. The scope and sophistication of this operation was unlike anything we had encountered before. The federal investigation also uncovered evidence that Cordelia had been training others in her methods, apparently with the intention of creating a network of operatives who could continue her work even if she were captured or killed. Several individuals who had been closely associated with her were found to possess similar collections of personal information and had been using comparable methods to manipulate and control their targets. Following Cordelia's disappearance, federal agents worked for several years to dismantle the network she had created and to prosecute those who had been involved in her operations. However, many aspects of her system remained intact, and some investigators believed that her methods continued to be used by others long after she had vanished from the scene. The case took an unexpected turn in 1952 when federal authorities received reports that a woman matching Cordelia's description had been seen operating in New Orleans, apparently using similar methods to gather intelligence about prominent local families. Federal agents who investigated these reports found evidence of a sophisticated information-gathering operation that bore all the hallmarks of Cordelia's previous work. The subject appears to have established herself as a fortune-teller and genealogist, Agent William Morrison reported from New Orleans. She has been approaching wealthy families under the pretense of researching their family histories, but our investigation suggests that she is actually gathering information for blackmail and manipulation purposes. Her methods are virtually identical to those documented in the Virginia cases. However, when federal agents attempted to apprehend the suspect, they discovered that she had already fled the area, leaving behind only a rented room filled with personal documents and correspondence belonging to various New Orleans families. The pattern was identical to what had been found in Virginia 15 years earlier, suggesting that Cordelia had simply relocated her operations rather than abandoning them entirely. The 1952 New Orleans incident was the last confirmed sighting of Cordelia Ravenscraft, though federal investigators continued to receive occasional reports of similar operations in other parts of the country. Some law enforcement officials believed that she had trained successors who carried on her work using her methods, while others suspected that she had simply become more careful about avoiding detection. The final known reference to Cordelia appeared in a classified FBI memorandum dated March 7, 1967, 30 years after her original disappearance from Virginia. The document reported that a woman matching her description had been identified through surveillance photographs taken during an investigation of organized crime activities in Chicago. However, by the time agents arrived to investigate, the woman had once again vanished without a trace. The memorandum noted that the Chicago operation showed evidence of the same sophisticated intelligence-gathering methods that had characterized Cordelia's previous activities. Subject appears to have infiltrated several prominent families and has been systematically gathering information about their business dealings and personal affairs, the FBI report stated. The scope and complexity of this operation suggests either that the original subject is still active or that her methods have been adopted by others with similar capabilities. Federal investigators eventually concluded that Cordelia had likely spent the 3 decades following her disappearance from Virginia continuing to operate her intelligence network, moving from city to city and assuming different identities as necessary to avoid detection. The 1967 Chicago sighting was significant because it suggested that she was still alive and active 30 years after her initial flight from Virginia, when she would have been nearly 70 years old. The case of Cordelia Ravenscraft was finally closed by federal authorities in 1970, though many aspects of her network and its activities remained unresolved. The official conclusion was that she had likely died sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s, ending a criminal career that had spanned more than 4 decades and had affected hundreds of individuals throughout multiple states. However, some investigators remained convinced that Cordelia's influence continued beyond her death through the network of operatives she had trained and the methods she had developed. The techniques she had pioneered for gathering and exploiting personal information would later be recognized as precursors to modern identity theft and information warfare tactics. Dr. Margaret Whitestone, the federal psychologist who had evaluated Agent Ashworth, published a detailed analysis of the Cordelia Ravenscraft case in 1968. Her study, which was initially classified but later released to academic researchers, provided insights into the psychological profile of one of America's most dangerous criminal operators. The subject represents a nearly perfect example of what psychologists now recognize as antisocial personality disorder combined with exceptional intelligence and manipulative ability. Dr. Whitestone wrote, "She demonstrated a complete absence of empathy or moral constraints, viewing other human beings purely as resources to be exploited for personal gain. Her ability to inspire trust and affection in her victims was not based on genuine emotion, but rather on a calculated understanding of human psychology." Dr. Whitestone's analysis also examined the factors that had enabled Cordelia to operate successfully for so many years without being detected or stopped. The subject's success can be attributed to several factors, she wrote. First, she operated in an era when information security was much less sophisticated than it is today. Second, she targeted individuals who had strong incentives to keep their victimization secret. Third, she was careful to eliminate witnesses and evidence that could be used against her. The psychologist's report also addressed the question of whether Cordelia's criminal behavior was the result of mental illness or conscious choice. While the subject clearly suffered from severe personality disorders, her actions were deliberate and calculated rather than impulsive or irrational, Dr. Whitestone concluded. She understood the consequences of her actions and made conscious decisions to harm others for her own benefit. Her mental condition may explain her lack of empathy, but it does not excuse or justify her criminal behavior. The academic study of the Cordelia Ravenscraft case continued for decades after her disappearance, with researchers in criminology, psychology, and intelligence studies examining her methods and their implications for law enforcement and national security. Her case became a textbook example of how personal relationships could be weaponized for criminal purposes and how traditional investigative methods could be inadequate against sophisticated manipulation tactics. Professor Jonathan Harwick of Georgetown University published a comprehensive study of the case in 1975, examining its broader implications for American society and law enforcement. The Ravenscraft case represents a watershed moment in the evolution of criminal methodology, Harwick wrote. It demonstrated that traditional crimes like murder and theft were being supplemented by more sophisticated forms of manipulation and control that were much harder to detect and prosecute. However, Harwick's research was cut short when he received anonymous threats that included specific details about his personal life and family background. The threats were so detailed and accurate that federal investigators suspected they had come from someone with access to confidential information about Harwick's background. The researcher abandoned his study and never published the planned follow-up volumes, leading to speculation that Cordelia's network might still be active decades after her disappearance. The case of Cordelia Ravenscraft remains one of the most studied examples of criminal intelligence operations in American history. Her 3 marriages, each ending in the death of her husband, represented a systematic exploitation of trust and intimacy that resulted in one of the most extensive information gathering and manipulation networks ever documented by federal authorities. The investigation revealed not only the scope of Cordelia's individual crimes, but also significant vulnerabilities in the security systems of law enforcement agencies, legal practices, and other institutions that handle sensitive information. The federal reforms implemented as a result of her case helped to establish more robust procedures for protecting classified information and detecting internal security breaches. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Cordelia's methods and network may have survived her disappearance and continued to operate under different leadership. The threats received by researchers and journalists who attempted to investigate her case suggest that some aspects of her organization remained active decades after she had vanished from Virginia. The mountain house where Cordelia lived with her 3 husbands was eventually purchased by the federal government and demolished in 1955 as part of the investigation into her activities. The land was incorporated into Shenandoah National Park, where it remains today as a quiet meadow surrounded by forest. Few visitors to the park are aware of the dark history that once unfolded in that peaceful valley. Yet the legacy of what happened in that isolated house continues to influence law enforcement practices and security procedures throughout the United States. The case of Cordelia Ravenscraft serves as a permanent reminder of the dangers posed by individuals who are willing to exploit human relationships and institutions for personal gain, and of the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would use trust as a weapon. The secrets that Cordelia collected, the lives she destroyed, and the institutions she corrupted represent more than just the crimes of a single individual. They reflect broader vulnerabilities in American society and the ongoing challenge of protecting personal privacy and institutional security in an interconnected world where information has become the ultimate source of power. As federal investigators concluded in their final report on the case, the story of Cordelia Ravenscraft and her 3 deceased husbands represents not just a criminal investigation, but a cautionary tale about the price of trust betrayed and the enduring consequences of allowing dangerous individuals to operate without effective oversight or accountability. The macabre veil she wore as a widow concealed not grief, but calculation, and the secrets she gathered behind that veil continue to cast shadows over the institutions and communities she targeted more than 8 decades ago.